for Demographic Science. And today we will have our main and 7th lesson on, well, how to use big data for the good, in a sense. So let me take just 1 second to share with you some information. You may already know this, but let me remember you. So recall to register yourself. You can do it either by scanning the QR code here on the screen, or by clicking on this link. You will have this the link also in the chat, such that you can use. So today we are going to interact through Mentimeter. So if you want to pose any question to Professor Kashyap from Oxford, or to the discussants, I will introduce you to the discussants later on. You can go on www.menti.com and use the code A5901042. So recall 85901042. So let me introduce briefly the topic of the discussion. So we're going to put together big data and public good. Well, it's not a simple association, but I'm sure that Ridhi will make this association intelligible for every one of us. So let me take 2 minutes to introduce Ridhi. Ridhi is currently Associate Professor at the University of Oxford within the Leverhulme Center for Demographic Science, and Associate Professor at the Nuffield College, University of Oxford. Her research is amazing because she uses different sources of data to study different aspects of the social interaction of women and men within societies, and demography. So I know Ridhi since long time, so I'm a little bit biased in my opinion, but let me tell you that she's really amazing, and you will see how amazing she is during this presentation. So I will now leave the floor to Ridhi, and I will take once more the word just after her lesson to show you some results of a big survey we did together with people all over the web. And then I will leave the floor to Ian and Andrea, who's going to discuss a little bit what Ridhi is going to tell us. Well, remember, if you want to to pose any question to Ridhi or to the discussants or to me, don't use the chat, but use www.menti.com and insert the code A5901042. So Ridhi, thank you for being here with us. It's amazing to have you on board, and thank you for your presentation. One quick information for those of you who are not familiar with English. There are 2 translations available, one in Spanish and one in Portuguese, and you can enter the room for those translations. Thank you so much, Ridhi. The floor is yours.
Great. Thank you very much, Valentina. That's a very generous introduction. I'm going to start sharing my screen. Can you confirm that you can see it? Great, excellent. Well, thank you so much for having me as a part of this really exciting school and initiative. And I'm going to talk today about harnessing big data as a public good. And I'll talk a bit about the promises of this approach and why I think we should be thinking of big data as a public good, because of the certain features that big data has, but also about what I see as some of the challenges and potential pitfalls of this approach. So to start with, I want to start by describing what is clearly something that we've lived through in the last 20 years, which is the digital revolution, right? And the digital revolution is this tremendous expansion in internet and mobile phones, as well as other digital technologies that has taken place really late 1990s and early 2000s. So we first see that here in this graph, these are from data from the International Communication Union, is a UN agency dedicated to monitoring telecommunication proliferation across the world. And we see here that mobile phones, so this is cellular, right, has really expanded since the early 2000s. And we see lots of, just fast growth in mobile technologies, as well as fast growth also in fixed internet and mobile technologies that are taking place. So that's here mobile internet, right, since the mid 2000s, as well as fixed internet technologies, which is sort of broadband internet occurring since the 2000s. So we see that this digital revolution has occurred really globally. And if we take a look at the next figure, we see here that this is not just something that is happening in one part of the world, it's really happening everywhere. These technologies are diffusing, they're spreading everywhere, and they are really they're a social transformation, the spread of these new technologies. We all have mobile phones, we access information, we communicate with each other, we also access vital goods and services through technologies such as mobile phones and mobile internet, as well as just our computers. We're having this conversation, for example, today over the internet. And these are really remarkable changes that, if you think about it from the standpoint, have only really taken place roughly in the past 2.5 decades, right? So I want to start by saying that this is a digital revolution, that is a social revolution first and foremost, that it had a lot of change, it has had a lot of impacts on our social lives, but it's also, from a perspective of data, it's also a data revolution. And it's a data revolution because our use of new technologies has created what's sometimes called the big data era, a new time for how data exists in the world. And there's a very nice definition. This is from a UN report, World That Counts, that was published as a part of a UN initiative called Data Revolution Initiative, to think about how we can use different kinds of data for improving the quality of global statistics. This report defines the big data era as an explosion in the volume of data, the speed with which data are produced, the numbers of producers of data, the dissemination of data, and the range of things on which there is data that is coming from these new technologies, such as mobile phones and the internet of things, and from other sources such as qualitative data, citizen-generated data, and perceptions data. So from this definition, if we think about the digital revolution as a data revolution, right, we can think about the digital revolution as creating new volumes and new streams of data, right? So that's the point about volume, but also creating data that are very fast, that are generated very quickly, as well as are very varied, very diverse, because they're different producers of these data. There's a kind of decentralization of data generation where it's not just coming from one source, but it's coming from different sources. If we think, for example, about the kind of information that's available online, a lot of different sources of information are available online. And that's why the producers of data are also different and much more varied. So that's sort of some of the key features of what's this data revolution that has emerged from the digital revolution. And that's something that I'm going to develop a bit more as I define the features of this data revolution in my discussion today. So what's our vision? So we see clearly that, there is a data revolution that is occurring as a consequence of the digital revolution. But what is it that we really want to do with this data revolution? And I really like this quote, which also comes from the same report on A World That Counts, which says that the vision is that we want to integrate, so the integration of these new data with traditional data to produce high quality information that is more detailed, timely, and relevant for many purposes and users, but especially to foster and monitor sustainable development. So what this vision is telling us is we now know that there's so many different types of data sources available that are generated from our use of new technologies. So what can we do with them? Well, they're clearly being generated, they exist. However, to make them purposeful, to make them meaningful, we need to find ways to integrate them with traditional data so that we can produce information that is high quality, that is reliable, but is also more detailed and relevant for different stakeholders, for different kinds of users, and for different purposes, with the goal that we eventually want to use these to leave no one behind in who we're able to measure and who we're able to, whose lives we're able to really understand, right? And that's the vision for more inclusive social measurement so that we can monitor global social development as it is occurring. So I'm a demographer, right? I'm a social scientist who is interested in measuring and mapping populations, human populations across time, across different geographies. And for me, data are really powerful because they tell us the experiences and lives of different people. They tell us, how people live, differences and inequalities between different groups. And they also give us a broader understanding of social change as it is occurring or when it is not occurring. So from my perspective as a demographer, as a demographer who has used or who uses sort of often large scale quantitative data about societies and about populations, right, this data revolution is extremely exciting because it gives us the opportunity to apply our skills of data analysis to understand and discover new aspects of human relations, to understand inequalities, for example, in new ways, right? But at the same time, as a demographer, I also know that there are certain kinds of challenges that come with the analysis and the measurement opportunities that are provided by these data. Some of these are, of course, methodological challenges, but some of these are also important sort of ethical challenges linked to who owns these data, right? Who has control over these data, and what are the sources of bias, who is missing from these data that we need to be concerned about when using them. So these are the kinds of questions that I want to sort of give you a brief overview of today in my presentation, but I also want to sort of emphasize that this is really a part of a bigger global discussion that is taking place in the context of the digital revolution that has created the data revolution. So let's start with some definitions. And actually, you'll be surprised to know that there isn't really one definition of what big data, what is big data. And actually, there are so many different ways of conceptualizing this. So I'm going to talk a bit about different approaches to it, but also at the same time, in my discussion of big data, also comment a bit on what I see as kind of really valuable features, the promises of big data. So one commonly used definition of big data is to sort of say that big data is really sort of defined by three properties, the three V's. So that's volume, variety, and velocity. Now, in the definition that I used from the A World That Counts report that I talked about earlier, you saw that this was already mentioned. They were talking a bit about the volume and the speed, and they were talking about the fact that there's so many different kinds of sources, the variety of data. So perhaps it's not surprising to you now that these three properties or these three features are often used to characterize sort of what is big data, right? Now, for those who are enthusiastic, they add two more V's. They say that actually the nice thing about these new forms of data, big data that's coming from the internet, from mobile phones, from other digital technologies, also such as satellites, is that these forms of data are also, likely to have greater value because they have better, geographical resolution, or they provide more frequent measurement than sort of traditional sources that social scientists and demographers and policymakers have used, like survey data or census-based data sources. So they offer much more value, and they're also more likely to sort of be true, or they have more veracity, right? And veracity here is the idea that we get sort of somehow better measurement than we would from places or from questions that we would ask in a survey, because these data somehow capture real behaviors. For example, when a mobile phone is being used, as opposed to when it is being reported as being used, actually measuring use is a real behavior, as opposed to a self-reported measure, which might give us somehow, people might report wrong, or they might not know. So if we can actually measure by measuring behaviors, we get sort of more true measurement. So that's sort of, for those who are enthusiastic about this, they see this as a big positive. On the other hand, for those who are skeptical of the use of big data for social measurement, for understanding social processes, for uncovering new forms of inequalities between people or across different countries or across different subnational areas within countries. The idea then for them is, the reason they're skeptical is they say, well, we don't actually know what we're measuring. These data are vague, or they're vacuous. They're vacuous in the sense they're a bit empty. We might sort of come up with some kind of behavioral indicator, but we actually don't know what really it means. And so in a sense, there's a debate about, how is this sort of, what are really the features, and are these features really powerful or not? And I sort of want to, emphasize that this definition is quite fluid in terms of what are really the features of big data. Is it purely in terms of new data that are coming from technologies, or is this, and if these new technologies are generating new data, what are the properties of it that make it distinct, is really an active debate also amongst the community of sort of scholars and policymakers interested in using and applying insights from big data. So one definition that I really like of big data is this one from Matthew Salganik, and this one is actually taking a step away from defining big data in terms of the qualities of features, but actually talking a bit about how these data are generated. So the data generating process is useful for defining these data. And Salganik says that big data are created and collected by companies and governments for purposes other than research. So what defines big data for Salganik is not whether their volume or their variety or velocity, although that could also be relevant, but it's really about the source of how these data are generated. And for Salganik, the key point here is that these are data that were not collected by social researchers or some kind of were not collected by a social researcher from the perspective of doing some kind of targeted research, right? So this is not, for example, a survey. A survey is custom made from the perspective of a researcher wanting to detect something, and that involves going into a particular context with a particular questionnaire and then asking questions. So these data are different. They're not about like asking questions in the context of a survey, but actually they're much more, they're just data that are generated as just byproducts, either the byproducts of our use of technology, like the mobile phone, social media, or the internet, or they can also be administrative records that are generated, and hence this reference to the government. They can, for example, tax records. Our taxes generated because of administrative workflows in government that have nothing to do with actually telling someone, how much taxes. That information just gets registered anyway, right? So administrative functions of government are also generating data, but these are not necessarily, these are different from the conventional survey model in which we ask questions and then get elicit a response. So in that sense, what's key about the definition is that these data are not really custom made for research in the way that survey researchers usually think of data, but they're actually just generated. They're ready-made data that then need to be repurposed somehow for research. And this repurposing comes with both positives, promises, but it also comes with potential challenges or as I'll keep talking about over the course of my lecture today. Right. So let's talk a bit more about these sort of positive features of big data before we come to some of the challenges. So the first positive is, if we think about big data as just any data that are the byproducts of the digitalization of our lives, or also byproducts of, say, government administrative functions, but purely from the perspective of just data that exist rather than were actively collected because of some kind of survey research which was targeted, right? So if you think about this definition of big data, like the Salganik one, then working from that, we can think about some of the positive features of some of these sort of big data sources that exist. So first of this is volume, right? So there's a clearly, digital technologies are pervasive, everywhere. Every little thing we do generates a data byproduct. As a result, these data have a lot of volume. They have high levels of resolution of different kinds. But in order to do something with these data, we obviously need to have improvements in computational power and digital tools, which have actually occurred significantly in the last 20 years, such that the collection, transmission, storage, and analysis of different kinds of big data are now just much easier than they were before. This is not to say that, technical capacity is equally distributed across the world, right? There are still significant inequalities in technological capacities and technological skills that limit how much different kinds of users can make sense and actually leverage the power of the data that they have. But at the same time, there's just no denying that on average, computational power and digital tools have improved so much that data now, there's more value that can be potentially extracted from different kinds of data sets, including very large ones, such as the big data sets that are generated as byproducts of the use of digital technology. A second feature of sort of the big data revolution is velocity or speed, right? So the new kinds of data sources that we have are arguably have a potential to provide much faster measurement because they're kind of always on, as opposed to reactive, where something happens and then we want to go and understand it and then we go ask people about it, right? So this model, if the data stream is always on, as it might well be if we're actually looking at data sets or data sources that are the byproducts of our use of technologies. If our technologies are ever present, well, then the data are always present, right? So they're in some sense much faster because they're always on. And as a result of this, they allow for what's been called nowcasting, the idea that they can be used for measuring or predicting the present, as opposed to doing things or measuring things that might have happened really a long time ago, but we only got to asking about them now. And this idea has really been popularized because one of the big challenges of sort of traditional models of social or policy research, which rely on, again, sort of asking questions, right? Those models often result in becoming outdated very quickly. So, we might ask about sort of, what are the current trends in the labor market, but actually by the time that those data are captured and then sort of collected and then cleaned and then published, right, they might be already several months old. And then we might not know what's happening at the moment, but what happened a few months ago, even in places where there are good infrastructures available for data collection and processing. So here's an example of sort of this nowcasting idea, which was really popularized by, firstly, by Google, the search engine that everyone knows about and uses. And the team within Google, which was called the Google Flu team, right, found that if we would think about health surveillance or monitoring health indicators, such as the spread of influenza, the flu virus, then they found that actually searches related to the flu were very good at predicting actual flu patterns or actual spread of influenza. So this is from, this is from the US, where here we see that essentially these are just flu patterns that are here or that are measured using actual searches linked to flu or like symptoms. So this already started towards, in 2008 and 9, they set up within Google when they started realizing that they help monitor where flu outbreaks are going to take place based on search behavior, because everyone was using Google to search for these kinds of things. But on the other hand, this seemed to work reasonably well from like 2000 until 2010. But then actually at some point, Google started over-predicting. The Google search indicators started over-predicting flu. And I'll come back to, why that happened, and the fact that, big data are not always reliable or stable. But for the most part, this example of the Google flu was really the first example of how, real-time measures coming from search indices that are aggregated could help predict and help monitor a social phenomenon, here being flu outbreaks, in a way that is much easier and faster than sort of conventional flu tracking, which would rely on just sort of looking at past trends in the flu, which is what sort of, public health surveillance agencies like here, the Center for Disease Controls, were doing. Another example from some of my own work of sort of nowcasting indicators, social indicators of interest, is from our work here on digitalgendergaps.org, where where we use data from social media to try and monitor global gender inequalities in internet access and mobile access. Now, this is an indicator where we actually would like to know, are men and women equally online and using new technologies? This is an important part of the global sustainable development agenda, where we would really like to sort of monitor digital access and digital inclusion. But often we find that conventional, traditional sources like surveys and censuses don't have information as readily available on digital access by gender. So here we find that we can actually measure these by relying on social media, because often the use of social media is, like, for example, here, Facebook is a reasonably good proxy of actually digital access in many parts of the world. And as a result, we can measure in real time with high frequency what is digital gender inequality in the form of internet access inequalities or mobile access inequalities across the world. So we see in this figure from our website that in many parts of South Asia and in sub-Saharan Africa, women are much less likely to be on than men. And this is something that we can monitor routinely because of the high frequency estimates that we're able to get from social media marketing data or social media data than we would in a traditional survey. So again, the velocity, the fact that these are likely to be always on sources is really a valuable feature of big data. Another feature is that they provide new kinds of data sources that might not be easily captured in traditional sources, because people might not want to reveal their preferences, or they might not want to reveal certain kinds of behaviors that are very private, or that come with the potential for sort of social desirability bias. Social desirability bias is when individuals might not want to disclose information to a survey, to a person sort of doing a survey, because they want to come across as as being socially desirable. So they don't want to disclose certain kinds of information or their specific needs or specific kinds of behaviors or practices that they might have. So an example of this is here. This is a paper in which they found that they looked at aggregated information on search behavior linked to abortion. And they found that in parts of the world where there actually search volumes for abortion were high, that actually the prevalence of abortion was relatively low. And the way they interpret this relationship is that in many of these countries, people are turning to the internet to search for this information, which reflects certain kinds of health behaviors and unmet health needs in certain populations, where our digital footprints could provide an insight into, which we might not have if, for example, in a context where there are other kinds of social norms, this might not be easily disclosed in the context of a survey or other forms of traditional data collection, which involve asking about things. So as I said, this is an example just of a kind of a variety, search queries or moods or sentiments are the kinds of variety of data sources that we could get from big data like sources that we would not get from traditional, that we might find difficult in some cases to capture in traditional sources, where there are social norms that, for example, make the disclosure of certain kinds of information more challenging in a kind of research environment. Right, so we can capture sometimes new needs and new behaviors that we might not capture otherwise. And another feature of big data is that they can provide greater value. Now, this greater value can come in the form of better geographical coverage for information that we might not get in sort of surveys and censuses. So, for example, in my work on digital gender gaps, where we're interested in monitoring gender gaps and gender inequalities in internet and mobile access, when we actually tried to find global surveys that collect information on internet use and mobile use by gender of the user, we found that actually there are many parts of the world where these surveys just don't exist at all. So here's what we found when we did this scoping, we did this analysis, we found that in many parts of Africa, many parts of South and East Asia, as well as even in some parts of North America, we didn't have a reasonably recent survey that could go and provide us this information on, so that we could compute gender inequalities in internet access or in mobile phones and other kinds of digital connectivity behaviors. And in this sense, the information that we got from a big data source here from the social media, data helped fill a data gap to improve our geographical coverage of a measure that is very important for us to be able to measure and also understand over time, but we wouldn't be able to do it given the lack of these indicators and these measures in conventional sources like surveys. These data sources can also provide sometimes greater geographical resolution, very detailed measurement at detailed subnational geographies than would be the case in in the case of a sort of a survey or in the case of a survey like instrument, where getting to very small geographies is often quite tricky because, of course, it's costly to ask people a lot of questions. It's costly to ask a lot of people at very detailed local areas a lot of questions, because that requires us to ask more and more people to get precision at smaller areas. And as a result of this, one of the challenges that happens is there's concerns of cost and cost efficiency, which result in survey size being more limited. And as a result, we don't actually know things at high geographical resolution because of these trade-offs. And one way to get around this is that sources, for example, here, this is from one of the papers that I had recommended for this lecture by Blumenstock and colleagues. Here they find that using mobile phone call detail records, so use of mobile phone as a behavior, is generally very strongly predictive of wealth, of socioeconomic status for individuals. And here, using that correlation between mobile use and wealth, or alternately poverty, they're able to come up with high resolution maps of poverty and wealth from these mobile call records, which are then aggregated but still aggregated to a very detailed geographical resolution that would probably be very hard and very costly to obtain from an equivalent survey-like instrument. So there's sort of these arguments that are often made that there's a higher resolution and better coverage that can provide cost efficiency with these kinds of data sources that would otherwise be hard to achieve, right? So I've talked a lot now about these promises, right? Clearly there's a lot of interesting opportunities and great opportunities for improved velocity, value, and so on from big data sources. But what about some of these perils? What are some of these difficulties and challenges that I also mentioned before at the beginning of my talk? What are these? Well, the first thing that we have to remember is, to come back to the definition of big data as data that are generated as byproducts rather than collected specifically for research, right? Now, there's in the tradition of social research where data are collected for research, one of the big concerns we have is we want our data to be clearly representative of a population that we're interested in, right? So one of the big challenges with data that are not explicitly collected for research, but instead are collected as byproducts of our use of technologies or as byproducts of some other function of governments or of companies. The challenge is that these data are big, but they're also likely to be biased and not representative in the way that traditional data sources have worked very hard to be. And one way, this is clearly an important challenge, but it's not one that is necessarily one that we cannot get around. And one way to get around this is that we want to validate against other data sources. So for example, in my work, again, to come back to digitalgendergaps.org, we clearly find that if we're just going to start relying on internet-based or social media data, well, we clearly see some groups are underrepresented online. So in my work, we found that women are in South Asia and in sub-Saharan Africa, there are strong, large gender inequalities disfavoring women. So women are much less likely to use digital technologies. Now, if women are much less likely to use digital technologies, but then we use these same digital technologies to do social measurement, well, that's not a good idea, because we're not going to capture the groups that we're actually interested in capturing some kinds of, we want to know more about. another example of this, for example, is from the Blumenstock paper as well, where they found that in high density areas, right, the predictive performance of mobile phone records was better than in low density areas. It shows clearly that, these kinds of substitute measures, if we did actually decide that we wanted to use mobile phones for measuring poverty and wealth, well, it didn't work as well everywhere, because it was much better at predicting wealth and poverty in high density areas than in low density areas. So these are examples of how there are clearly some kinds of measurement concerns and biases of who is captured and who is not captured in big data that really are important for us to think about, especially if we're going to use these to solve problems. So if, for example, we want to solve problems of inequality, but those groups are not even captured and we don't even understand what's going on with them in these sources, then it's, it only gives us a very, very obscure and unclear view of what's actually the processes as they're in the world. Another clear challenge with big data sources, and this again comes back to, if we think about big data sources as being defined by the fact that they're sort of byproducts rather than actively collected for research. So if we think about big data sources as byproducts of digital technology, byproducts of commercial transactions, then they also have a bit of an obscure data generating process. We don't know how exactly these data are being generated. For example, with a survey, we know very clearly what the questions are and how the responses to those questions are structured. This is clearly not the case if we're just collecting information from big data where there is an unclear or an obscure data generating mechanism. So this example is really nicely clarified if we come back to the Google flu, right? And I said Google flu was the first example of the use of big data for public health surveillance. It could tell us what people were searching, and searching related to the flu could help predict where flu outbreaks were going to take place. However, sometime starting the 2012, Google started over predicting flu estimates. Much more flu was being predicted based on search behavior than was actually the case in the real world. Now, why is that happened? Well, one reason for that is that just the behaviors linked to the use of Google just changed over time. And because those behaviors, how people were using the flu, right, as well as how people were using Google, as well as how the algorithms that provided people information about what to search changed over time, just resulted in changes in interaction platform, which then had implications for its ability to predict something that was happening in the real world. So over time, Google's algorithm changed such that it started recommending certain search terms to people who were searching for different things. And because of this changes in the recommendation system, which is how the algorithm functions, this had implications for how effective these data were at predicting real world trends. So that's an issue of sort of data reliability, which result in the behaviors not being stable over time, just because the use of certain kinds of technologies just changes, right? And the third really important issue when it comes to thinking about what are the sort of challenges with big data as a public good is, well, who really owns these data, right? So to come back to the question of ownership, now, in a sense, we use mobile phones, we use the internet. These devices clearly belong to us, but at the same time, within the broader socio-technical system of the internet, the apps that we use or the technologies that we use are clearly those that are provided by private companies. Often these private companies are using this information. So we set up an account with them. They use our information in some way that serves their company's function, right? But at the same time, so do they own our data or do we own our data? Now, for the most part, commercial transactions, they're sort of governed by certain kinds of legal or regulatory frameworks that actually vary across time space. They cross different places, they vary across different places. But at the same time, this raises the question, if there's great value to these data sources, but at the same time, the ownership structures vary so much across different countries, across different legal regimes, then how we can extract value from these different sources is also not standardized, right? So this is a big sort of question forward. There's clearly value to use of big data, but questions of ownership determine to what extent how value can really be extracted from them. And that's something that isn't something that is homogenized or there are standards for, but I think are needed. These standards are needed if we are to really extract full value from big data and extract their best potential moving forward. A second issue is that there is a lack of informed consent, clearly, right? So unlike a survey where clearly questions are asked and then responses are made to survey questions, these data are just collected anyway. Cookies are collected as a result of our use of technologies. And while we're told about it now, thanks to certain kinds of legal protections in Europe, such as the GDPR, for the most part, right, informed consent in the way that it exists for traditional models of social research don't exist for big data. Does that mean, however, that we should not use them? Again, this is a question where there is an important policy as well as an ethical debate to be had. And I think moving forward, finding ways to reconcile informed consent imperatives with those about who owns and who has what value can be extracted from data are two discussions that need to happen at the same time. And while privacy is clearly an important prerogative, right, there are different ways in which issues of privacy can be dealt by different forms of data aggregation. So we don't have to reveal anything about specific individuals, but at the same time, by aggregating it, we can still reveal meaningful insights about the social world. Now, concerns about privacy will keep coming up in our discussion of how best to use data in a way that respects individual freedom, individual autonomy, but at the same time extracts meaningful social insights. And in order to do that, we need to realize that while data misuse is clearly a problem with the proliferation of more and more data, if we don't extract meaningful information from data as well, that's a misuse of data. And finding the balance between data misuse and data misuse is really the key to unlocking data as big data as a public good. So I'm going to stop here with my talk, and I'm looking forward to the questions as well as discussions with the discussants. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ridhi. Thank you so much for your presentation. Now, let me take 1 second. Ridhi, if you can stop sharing the screen. I need to share it for a while. Thank you so much. So let me take 1 second to show you all the questions that we collected in the meanwhile through Mentimeter. Now I will stop here the collection of questions, and I just ask you, please, to follow a little bit this discussion of Ridhi's presentation. So today we did a sort of exercise. We looked at where people search through Google for terms like public good, commons, or words related to this topic, and we find that actually the majority of people looked for those information in countries where, let's say, internet penetration is lower, but poverty and social exclusion is higher. So like in Zambia, in Ethiopia, in Zimbabwe, in Kenya. But if we look at where people search on Google for terms like big data, well, we found that actually people search more for information with respect to big data in countries like China, Singapore, Hong Kong, Tunisia, and so on and so forth. So we have a sort of differentiation between where people look for public good or commons or something related to the usability of big data and big data in different parts of the world. But this is not the end of the story. So we went forward with our exercise using big data, and we went to Twitter. And so we downloaded the last 100 tweets that were collected this morning, let's say from 9 to 10, which mentioned explicitly the term public good. And we saw that actually those tweets, so the corpus, the text of those tweets included also a word like cancer or COVID, but also media and dream, and also social media, and also music, for instance, or poems, which was a sort of, which was in a sense interesting from our standpoint, because it gave us the idea that actually data, but also health, and also music, and also poetry can be intended as public good. And also social media and media communication can be actually related to public goods or commons, as Ridhi was correctly saying before. And then we looked at the same amount of tweets, so 100 tweets this morning, that were related to big data. And here we find also some words which were inside the same tweets for public good, like vaccine, health, but also social media, street, music, Google, market. Okay, so there is a consensus around the world about the fact that actually we need to exploit this data better to contribute to the good and not only to the bad, or to marketing or to the economy. But at the same time, those countries who look in the Google for public good or for commons are not the same countries who look in the Google for big data. So there is consensus, there is interest, but there is also a sort of mismatch between those two aspects. So I stop here and I ask you to go to menti.com and if possible to select among the set of questions that I'm going to input here, one question that we are going together to ask Ridhi at the end of this lesson. And now I leave the floor. So remember, www.menti.com and input the code 85901042. So now I leave the floor to our discussants. So first of all, Andrea Fazio from University of Pavia. Thank you, Andrea. You can activate your camera and your mic.
Hello. So hi, Ridhi. Hi, everyone. First of all, thank you very much for this very interesting lecture. I think it's a great topic, and then it's really interesting because it is something that we see and look at every day. I mean, I don't know whether I am one of those who brought big data in Twitter or Google this morning, but it is possible. So first of all, thank you very much. And then I wanted, I just had, I mean, I have many questions I have to say, but I just wanted to pose you some additional thoughts and questions about the usage of big data. Now, during your lecture, you mentioned the use of big data for health purposes, for example. Now, I have to say, I was a bit struck by the fact that during this pandemic period, let's say that still didn't find an end, or maybe it's finding an end. I was expecting that policymakers would have used much more big data. I mean, for example, thanks to a lot of apps or also to social networks, we have a lot of data about, I don't know, blood pressure also, or heartbeat, or how many steps every people does every day, and all these kind of stuff. So in pandemic periods, or also to monitor health, this is a great advantage, I think. But I was really struck by the fact that why, I mean, big companies are looking so much forward on big data, but policymakers are still, I mean, are so behind, let's say. So this really struck me. I don't know why. So here comes an additional question. So is it a problem of power, let's say? I mean, I guess that Google has much more power than Italy, for example, which is the country where I live. So in the usage of this data, really, I see the huge opportunity, but I do see also both the misuse and the missed use. So I just wanted to ask you a comment on this.
Should I respond now or should I wait?
No, Ridhi, if you can respond, it's fine. Thank you so much.
Okay, so I think that's a really great question, Andrea. And so I think I see your question as sort of like, two different types of questions. So the first is, why is it that we are not seeing more generally policymakers like using this more, especially at a time of need, like during the pandemic, when we need to. And I think this comes back to the question of, so first I would push back on the idea that they're not being used, right? I think they are being used, but in a way that maybe could be more transparent, right? And I think that's a first point linked to that there is some degree of use going on, and there is some discussion surrounding, for example, digital epidemiology has really become a real thing in this pandemic, in that, apps are being used for contact tracing. We are also sort of using that, people are monitoring public perceptions using different forms of different forms of big data as well. So, this is clearly a pandemic of a first kind that has occurred in a digital era, and that has unraveled and allowed for new kinds of possibilities, but it's also thrown open a lot of questions. The first question on open is like, well, it's thrown open the question of really like owns these data, and also if we want to connect a lot of different kinds of data, which is actually the way that we can make big data more powerful, right? What is the framework for doing this? And I think this pandemic has really thrown that question into sharp relief, because we don't have a common structure or a common framework, right? And the lack of that framework about how can we use big data, how can we use it appropriately, who owns this, and who gets to say how these are used, and how they can be linked to other kinds of data that still allow for balancing, the potential for misuse versus misuse, right? Allow so that both of those concerns are taken into account. I think this pandemic has shown us that we don't actually have a proper framework for that is agreeable across the board. And the fact that it's shown us why we need that ever more, right? Because this is clearly lots of different avenues where digital technologies could have helped here, right? They could have helped with like clearer contact tracing. They could have helped with sort of understanding social networks and disease flows much better, right? But many never possible to do this at scale because of some bottleneck beyond the sort of micro or some kind of small. And I think moving, I really hope we don't have another pandemic like this for a while. Time it really shows us the lack of framework, and it shows us the urgent need for this dialogue to happen now. And the fact that this is a global problem that requires a global solution, not one where we have ad hoc patchwork solutions in different parts of the world, right? Like, for example, there are certain regulations about GDPR that are relevant in like Europe, but those don't apply anywhere else. What does that mean? What does that mean for data sharing? What does that mean for transparency and ownership? So I think it shows us ever more that we need to have this discussion, and we need to come up with like regulatory frameworks everywhere, rather than just like local frameworks that address this. So I would say it's shown us the importance, but it's definitely shown us that we need to do much more to have these discussions more concretely.
Thank you, Ridhi. And thank you, Andrea, for your presence here and your question. So Ian, if you want to switch your camera on and also your mic, thank you so much.
Thank you, Valentina. Thank you, Andrea, for the question. And it's also very important for me, the point you raised. And thank you, Ridhi, for this great presentation. Well, so I will start from just a technical question. I'm wondering from the point of view of statistics. So as you might know, for the last years, there was like robots or fake accounts on the rise in the social networks, and they also produce some kind of behavior that can be treated as a human one. So is there some like frameworks or methodology to find out this behavior and to exclude the possibility of some kind of statistical errors caused by these fake accounts?
Again, I think a really important question, the sort of idea that a lot of what we might be measuring, this comes back to the point I made right at the end, that, a lot of the times what we might be measuring might be driven by, different kinds of black boxes, by algorithms, and also, things like bots or automated accounts, where we don't know if we're actually capturing real behaviors or behaviors that are created by algorithms or the platforms. Right? So knowing what's real from what's not real can sometimes be tricky. And I think this is a part of the sort of, so clearly there's like, I think companies that generate this data have an internal rationale for wanting to understand this and control this better, and they have their in-house sort of solutions, and they're trying to solve this problem from a sort of, technological standpoint. But I think there's also sort of the bigger point, right? That if these are also the places where a lot of important social discussions are taking place, if social media is where a lot of big discussions relevant for politics and society are taking place, but then these are sort of, where certain kinds of misinformation can become viral because of automated accounts, right? Then we also need to realize that there are real social impacts of these forms of information flow. So this is not just like something that requires a technological solution, but also requires sort of wider digital literacy and awareness amongst users, right? And it also requires ways in which a better informational, better forms of awareness of mis and disinformation is something that is taught as a part of a broader campaign of digital literacy and digital awareness. And I think, so one of the sort of, my response always is to say that, the digital revolution is clearly a data revolution, but it's also a social revolution, which requires that in order to realize its full potential, right, we need to make digital literacy a really key, important part of sort of education across the board, right? And digital literacy, I have a view of digital literacy where digital literacy isn't just like how to use a computer or how to use a mobile phone, but how to use it in a way that also makes us evaluate critically the information that we are exposed to it. So it's both a technological solution where we need to find a way to like fight bots and fight automated accounts because of their implications for the world, but it's also at the user end, as individual users, we need to sort of learn what are the sort of best practices around critical evaluation of information that we get through a decentralized model of information that now the internet and mobile phones provide us.
Thank you, Ian. Thank you, Ridhi. I think this was really an amazing discussion. So let me steal 10 minutes more of your time, just because, well, we voted online for the question to be posed to Ridhi. So we need to see the result of our voting. Let me see. Let me share the screen. Okay, are you ready? Yes, 3, 2, 1. Oh, 3, 2, 1 doesn't work. Why? 3, 2, 1. Okay, it doesn't work. Yes, it works. No, it doesn't. Okay. So this is the winner. How to interconnect local initiatives in order to better connect ecological producers and consumers with technologies also in rural areas. Can big data ever lead to any good if it remains monopolized by private organizations like Google, Facebook, Apple? So those two questions were the questions that won the competition. We had 53 voters. So Ridhi, if you can try to answer those two questions quickly, or maybe select one and answer the one that you prefer, it would be nice. And then I will take 2 minutes to conclude and present you the quick results of a survey that we ran through Facebook this morning.
Wow, very entrepreneurial. So this is, I think both of those are really great questions. So of course, I'll start by answering the second one, which is that can big data potential be fully realized if it remains monopolized only by some countries, by some companies? I think the answer is clearly no, right? And I think that's the sort of point that I'm making, that we need to recognize that that data ownership is, we need to sort of refashion a model of data ownership that realizes that these data have value, that we need to unlock their value, and that requires us to create models of data sharing, models of data transparency that allow different kinds of stakeholders to join this conversation, right? And I think this is a really key and important point of making big data a public good. And linked to the first point, the first question, which I see is also linked to this one, right? One way that we can unlock the value of big data as public good is actually by opening up and creating different models of data sharing and data transparency that also involves bringing different kinds of perspectives and stakeholders to the conversation table, which requires those, for example, in specific areas with specific needs to be in conversation with those who may have data, which in companies and governments, and to have an open and frank conversation about what are the data gaps, what is needed in order to solve specific issues and problems, to understand, the needs and priorities of populations. So that's, if we want to create a new model of data ownership and of data transparency, that requires us to bring individuals and actors from different levels, from civil society, from the private sector, and from governments, as well as from, academia and policy networks, to come together and be a part of this discussion rather than just, one group doing it alone. Then only can sort of the multifaceted interests really truly be reflected in the discussion.
Yeah, thank you, Ridhi. This is really important also from a policy perspective, and is also one of the, let's say, tasks that we as the economy of Francesco want to push for the next for the coming months and maybe years. So, well, let me take the last 5 minutes of your time to conclude by showing you something which I think is really, really, really interesting. So what we did this morning? Well, this morning we launched a survey through Facebook using Facebook ads. So we simply produce an ad, so something that pop up on Facebook users page, where we ask people to, first of all, describe what they think about public goods and what they think about big data, and then to answer few questions. One of those questions was actually this one. So, do you think that big data can be conceptualized as public goods? And actually we got around 250 responses, and 66.7% of the people replies, yes, I think that public good can be conceptualized as big data can be conceptualized as public good. And then we asked them, well, ever you participate in the economy of Francesco school? And the majority of them did, but few of them didn't. So 40% didn't, because we ran the ad through different populations located in different parts of the world, specifically in Africa, South Asia, and South America. And some of them were completely not aware of the economy of Francesco. So it was also a way to present the economy of Francesco to those populations who didn't know about it. So we went back one step forward, and we asked them, well, what do you expect from a lesson where we try to put together public goods, commons and big data. And those were the most cited answer. So something about privacy, the role of big data, and then understand how we can use big data knowledge to learn and to get information. And so we went one step forward and we said, well, we need now to understand how can we convince these, let's say, 33% of the population, of our experimental population, who replied, no, I don't think that big data can or should be conceptualized as public goods, to believe that, yes, indeed, we need to follow, to go in this direction, because we need to exploit or to leverage as much as we can the beauty and the good part of public goods, of big data, and forgetting about the evil part of big data. So what we did, we ran an experiment through Facebook. The result of those experiments will be discussed with you during the next EOF school workshop. So it's a sort of big introduction to a theme that we just started to work on, and I really hope we can work on this topic for the coming months, for the coming years, and bring this discussion into our workshop, but also in the web and potentially in the world. So I think we are now running out of time. I wish to thank everyone in this session. So, and also the people who are attending this lesson online. Of course, I would like to thank Ridhi Kashyap, Associate Professor at the University of Oxford, for this amazing lesson. When I introduced Ridhi, I was sure that she was giving an amazing presentation, and she did. So thank you, Ridhi. Thank you, Andrea. Ian, please switch your camera on. And then also thank you, Ian. Thank you, Andrea, for the discussion. Thank you, Paolo. Paolo, please, your camera, for organizing this school together with Maria, with Lourdes, with Isa, who are not connected today. And then Alvaro and Alejandro, thank you so much to both of you for providing for free a fantastic translation in Spanish and in Portuguese. So don't forget, please, next lesson will be amazing. We will have with us Jennifer Ledesky. The lesson will be on June the 9th at 4 p.m. as usually, Rome time. So don't forget it. Stay with us, and thank you so much for being here. It was amazing as usually.
Thank you. Bye-bye.